So let's move now to executive orders, because these are also, some of them are an important part of employment law. So an executive order is under the purview of the President of the United States, the executive branch, and it has an impact on anybody who does business with the federal government as well as anybody who works for the federal government. So when an executive order is passed, it's not something that affects the average business or the average organization or the average person in the United States. It only affects those companies doing business with the government and anybody who works for the government. It has the same force of law as a law does, but it is not technically a law because only Congress can make laws. I know it's all subtle changes, but it basically has the same impact as basically as any kind of law, except it only has a narrow scope in which it affects. So we'll start with the first and most important one, and that's Executive Order 11246. This passed signed into existence by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. And affirmative action is about making a good faith effort to attract and retain underrepresented employees in your organization, specifically women and minority groups. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to, if we're in an organization that's predominantly female, that we wouldn't make a good faith effort to try to attract men to the organization as well. But generally speaking, when we're talking about affirmative action, it's about ensuring that we're making that good faith effort to attract those who are underrepresented, which typically in most organizations are going to be women and minorities. Now, that also doesn't mean that we hire people, right? Because remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1991 said quotas are illegal. So affirmative action is not making any statements about who we should or shouldn't be hiring. The affirmative action is saying we have to make an effort to try to proactively reach out and attract different people to our organization, more diversity, more variety. It does not require us to hire somebody who's unqualified. So, who must do affirmative action? If you have a contract with the federal government and you have 50 employees and a $50,000 contract, you are responsible for doing affirmative action. You have to do it in order to be able to be eligible for a federal contract. And we'll talk about the OFCCP in a few minutes. They are responsible for managing those contracts. You can also be ordered by the courts to do affirmative action. And what that means is if you have a long history of discriminating against protected groups, whether it be men and you're discriminating against men or discriminating against women or whatever it might be, minority groups, you name it, you can be ordered by the courts to proactively do affirmative action in order to try to increase the diversity in your organization. And to do so in such a way that we don't we're not harming people. We're not hiring unqualified people. We are simply trying to make an effort to combat the historical discrimination that's occurred by the organization for a long period of time. So the goal is we want to attract as many people as we can to work for the organization. Then we have what we call voluntary compliance. And organizations can voluntarily choose to do affirmative action. No one requires them to do it. It is completely voluntary. So they can choose to attract and retain, or create efforts to attract and retain underrepresented groups to their organization. It is important, as I said, to know this has nothing to do with hiring. So what kinds of activities are usually covered under affirmative action? It's usually things like training programs, recruitment efforts. So if you're an organization that tends to be, let's say you're in construction and you are very you don't have a lot of diversity in your organization. It's largely white males, some minority males, but largely white males, very few females that work in construction. And in order for a lot of organizations that want to do contract work with the federal government, they're the ones that are really going to be obligated to do more affirmative action. So what's going to end up happening is they will reach out They will go to colleges and universities that have more diversity. So they're not just recruiting from the same old school. They're actually breaking free and trying to recruit from different schools. They might go to historically black colleges and universities. They might go to schools that have a high predominance of Latinos. They might go to a women's college that has an engineering program or a construction management program. But their goal is to do what they can to attract wider varieties of individuals, not just the same old people. So you would attract more people. And the goal is with recruiting is the better job we do in attracting people to the company and recruiting a wide pool of diverse people, the greater the likelihood we're going to find one of the best candidates that we can find. It doesn't always mean it's going to be somebody who is underrepresented. It just means that when we cast a wider net, we do a better job at recruiting, our selection process is going to be that much better because we have a wider variety of good quality candidates to choose from. So that's our goal. Like I said, the other thing is training, and we can be engaged in training people to make sure that they have the skill set needed to be promoted to the next level. Or we might invest in our local community and train people at the local community college or the local high school to make sure that we've got a ready workforce to come in and come work for us afterwards. That is diverse, right? Not just a narrow group of people, but that we are increasing the pool of qualified individuals. That's the goal of affirmative action. Increasing your pool of qualified individuals, either to hire them or to promote them to a different position. So anybody that tells you otherwise, either they misunderstand the law, they don't understand the law, or they're purposefully and intentionally trying to undermine the law in and of it. Well, not a law, the executive order in and of itself. The recent rulings that struck down affirmative action in higher education is very different than affirmative action in the hiring process. I don't expect at this time that this would change, but if it does, I will certainly redo this lecture and we can move on from there. But it is important to know that affirmative action is still appropriate. It's still required of anybody that fits one of those three categories. Well, two categories, the 50 employees and the $50,000 contract with the government, or they're ordered by the courts. Again, the voluntary compliance, that's what people are choosing to do. That's on them. Now, the next two executive orders have to do with sexual orientation and creating opportunities for people, regardless of their sexual orientation, in the federal government. And there had been many attempts back in the 90s to try to get legislation out there to protect sexual identity, sexual orientation, and gender identity in the workplace. And those efforts to create a law, ENDA was the law, it's Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and the efforts to pass those laws were undermined and never passed at that time. So in 1998, Bill Clinton decided to do what he could do under his purview to make sure that there was equal employment opportunity for those individuals that were identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Again, this does not include people who are transgender because it only includes sexual orientation here. And the same thing with Executive Order 13160. It's about making sure that people who are gay, lesbian, and bi have access to education and training opportunities, kind of like that affirmative action thing we were talking about, but they're making sure that they are not being discriminated against with the need to be able to advance their careers and to have opportunity for training and development activities. Now, we do know that in 2020, the Bostock decision by the Supreme Court said that sexual orientation and gender identity are included in the civil rights legislation. So it is included now, although it is not as strong as we would like, but it's definitely there. There's still a great push to have an Employment Non-Discrimination Act that is a little bit broader, that covers things like pronouns and things like that, because that's where we're finding that there's some big challenges in the courts that even though the guidelines from the EEOC said we should be using the proper pronouns for transgender people, apparently the ruling was that the Bostock ruling was more narrow than that, and that it didn't include the obligation to use people's pronouns. I will tell you, regardless of what the law is, that's something that we need to be respectful of. Who cares? I don't care who you want to be called. You want to be called he, she, you are. So if you identify as transgender, you are who you say you are. I accept that and with no questions and no doubts about that. And the important thing is that we need to honor somebody's pronouns. They know who they are better than I do. And it's not my job or my responsibility to tell somebody that their identity is inappropriate or that I won't honor that. That's not my right, to do. So these two executive orders came out because there wasn't any law or any interpretation of the law that Civil Rights Act protected sexual orientation or gender identity. So that's why this exists. So now let's talk a little bit about how the two government organizations manage these sorts of issues, right? When we have discrimination, who is responsible for that? If we have violations of the executive orders for affirmative action, who handles that? So we'll start with the EEOC. Their responsibility is to discern whether or not a case has merit based on the Civil Rights Act. And if it does, it can either give a letter to the complainant, the plaintiff, to say, yes, you have a case under the Civil Rights Act, or they can take on that case themselves. So that's an important part of that. So our litigation process then is the plaintiff then has to look at the elements of their case. And we've already talked about, right, that if you have disparate treatment, it's different than a disparate impact or adverse impact. And so we have to gather different data in order to be able to do that. So the plaintiff, if it's disparate treatment, which is intentional, as we discussed, the employer can say, no, it was non-discriminatory, and here's the reason why. And then the plaintiff can say, well, that may look good on surface, but really it's a pretext for discrimination. And we've seen this in all sorts of courses, in all sorts of cases, rather, where we have individuals who said, oh, well, they were late to work, so I had to fire them. But it's considered a pretext when we realize that other people who came to work were not fired, but this individual was fired, and it was not different temporarily from a discriminatory event or a complaint that was made about a discriminatory event. So it becomes the pretext. Like, I'm going to pretend that I'm doing this in a neutral way, but in fact, it is intentional. So the plaintiff, it has to be able to make their case then say, look, you say that you fired me because I was late, but yet all these other people are late and none of them ever got fired. So what's the difference between me? The difference is what you did was a pretext for just discriminating against me because you don't like me because I'm a woman, I'm a man, I'm gay, I'm straight, I'm whatever, right? Black, white. And so then the decision is then made in the courts about whether or not that was true or not, or at least what they believed based on the evidence, and then whatever the remedy is that the court orders. It could be affirmative action, it could be paying back wages, it could be all sorts of different things. On the bottom, right, was now where we talk about adverse impact or disparate impact, which is that this is a neutral practice, but it's having an adverse impact on people. So the plaintiff or plaintiffs in this case, it's usually a number of people that will argue this. It's a number of people involved in that because it's based on statistical analysis, right? And it's based on the impact on a group of people. And basically, they will say that this is a discriminatory practice, whether or not it was intended to, and it has a differential impact on protected groups. The defendant, the organization, can say, well, it's job-related. It's consistent with business necessity. The only response that the plaintiff can have to that is showing that it really isn't job-related. For example, the Griggs versus Duke Power, where the organization's like, oh, well, it's important to have a high school diploma in order to be able to do this job. But what they were able to show is there were people already there doing the job without a high school diploma. So it really isn't job related. It isn't business necessity to have a job for this particular job category to have a degree, a high school diploma. You can do the job without it. So that's how the plaintiff has to counter argue when the defendant, when the organization says, oh yeah, it's totally job related. You have to show that it's not job related. And then again, same thing, the court looks at it, they make their rule, and then they decide what the remedy is. Whether it's, you've had historical discrimination, so again, you have to do affirmative action, or we need to give back pay and benefits and promotional opportunities for individuals who were discriminated against by the organization. The OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, is the government agency or the government branch that is responsible for overseeing all the contracts, and affirmative action falls under this. Now, there's other contractual issues that they need to deal with, but the OFCCP specifically has to deal with affirmative action plans. Each employer that is required to do affirmative action because of their contractor status must submit their plan to the OFCCP. They will do audits of things. They will do site visits to review plans. Their goal here is they have a lot more enforcement power than the EEOC. Now, the EEOC interprets cases. The EEOC makes determinations whether or not someone has a case under the law. They may take on the mantle of representing that individual in court, but they don't have the force of law to say you discriminated and I'm going to punish you. They have the right to take people to court, to have the courts punish them if they're found guilty. OFCCP has the right to punish directly. They don't have to take people to court. They can say you are non-compliance, therefore I'm going to penalize you. There's a financial cost. There may be other issues that they need to deal with. They may lose their status as a contractor. And the goal here is simply that they are responsible for monitoring and making sure that the good faith effort is being done to make sure that those affirmative action plans are appropriate. And again, they are the body that makes the determination, not like the EEOC, which depends on the courts to make the determination. In terms of the EEOAA affirmative action best practices, there are a number of things that we need to make sure that we do as HR professionals and managers to ensure that we are doing the best we can to comply with the laws and the executive orders. Number one, comply with the law or executive order. Make sure that you understand the nuances of it. Make sure you are applying it appropriately, and that is a huge effort in terms of protecting ourselves legally. Number two, we want to make sure we're promoting equal employment and addressing all those barriers that affect equal employment. So here's the thing about what is considered to be fair and things like that. We can keep trying to solve the problems after the fact. And we're going to struggle with being able to do that because really, if we don't get to the source of the problem will still keep happening over and over again. And one of my favorite quotes from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he says, sometimes we have to pull people out of the river, which is sometimes we see a problem and we fix it. We try to remedy and make things better for someone who's experienced something negative, right? We can do this all day long, but it doesn't exhaust it, but we never exhaust the pool of people coming to us because the people keep falling in the river. We keep having to pull them out. We keep having to rescue them. We keep having to address the problems that are happening after they happen. But what Archbishop Desmond Tutu goes on to say is sometimes we pull them out of the river, but sometimes we have to go upstream and figure out why do they keep falling in the river in the first place. Then as we focus on why people keep falling in the river, why these discriminatory actions keep happening, why we're still having problems with things, then that changes things entirely. And so when we address that, it makes things a lot easier downstream. Then we're not focusing all our efforts in rescue, we're focusing all our efforts on prevention in the first place. And we know when we focus on prevention versus rescue, we have a greater success rate for sure. We want to make sure our efforts and organizations show a management commitment and an accountability. So we have to have accountability systems embedded in our HR arena to make sure that managers know that this is what they're responsible for doing, and they have to be held accountable for it in their annual evaluations and in their daily activities. So you don't get to discriminate against someone and assume everybody's going to wink, wink, and nod, nod simply because you do a really good job at what you do. So therefore, we're not going to worry about the fact that you discriminate against just one person. People need to be held accountable for that. We want to make sure that there's good communication between managers and employees and with HR management and employees. Everybody's on the same page. Communication is transparent, that we're clear what we need to do and why we need to do it. We want to make sure that what we're doing in our equal employment and affirmative action activities is have what we call noteworthy results, which means we need to monitor. HR needs to monitor what's going on and demonstrating that these efforts are having an impact, that we are finding that we have more diversity in our pool of people, that we're finding we have less problems with the law because we're not discriminating, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, we want to make sure that what we are doing does not cause or result in unfairness. And when I say cause or result, I mean, it's different when we say we cause something to happen, it's intentional, and something results in discrimination or unfairness, it's not necessarily intentional. So cause or result, that phrasing is about differentiating between intentionality and no intentionality in your behaviors. But regardless, remember, not having the intention to discriminate doesn't mean you don't create harm nonetheless. That's why adverse impact is considered important under the law, because it can have an impact on people.